All right. So hello and welcome to our current conversation today on surviving ransomware attacks. My name's Christopher Cruz and I'm the Director of Cloud Marketing here at Intervision, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get into any of the formalities and introductions, I did want to extend a very sincere thank you, not only from myself, but from the entire Intervision team and our partners at AWS for joining this conversation today. I know that ransomware is probably the last thing in the world you really want to be thinking about, but it is a reality of today's business world. And I do think the content we've put together for you today is going to be actionable and insightful, but we'd love to hear your feedback after the fact, and we'd love to hear from you during the conversation as well. And speaking of that, I mentioned that this session will be recorded. And we will be sending out a recording of the webinar after the fact to everyone who registered, just in case you have to drop early or you can't make the live event. And we will also send out an opportunity to connect with some experts here to continue this discussion. In addition to that, during our conversation today, we would love to hear from you. As interactive as we can make this, the better. And you can use either your chat functionality or your Q&A functionality, which should be located on the right-hand side of your window there, to engage in this conversation, ask questions. We really want this to be an interactive conversation. So thanks in advance for joining the conversation. So you'll hear more about our story later in the conversation today, but for those of you who aren't aware, Intervision is a strategic service provider with over 25 years of experience helping IT leaders like yourself realize their strategic vision through a comprehensive portfolio of technology, services, and solutions. Through our consultative approach, we help our clients determine what's the right premise to host their applications, what's the technology that will best suit their strategy, and ultimately, and perhaps what's most importantly, what's the right delivery model for this? Would this be a service that you'd like to manage on your own, or perhaps get assistance, or offload the burden of managing it day to day through a fully managed model? And ultimately, our goal at Intervision is to help IT organizations run more effectively, grow more efficiently, and in many cases, transform the way they do business. And that's really what we're all about here at Intervision. And speaking of transformation, it's obvious that the power of technology to transform business is more than it's ever been exponentially. And we are more dependent on that technology than we ever have been. And unfortunately, criminals know that as well, right? And that's really where ransomware as a prevailing tool is starting to become more and more of an issue that we're all having to think about. And at Intervision, one of the things we try to do is a lot of listening to better understand what are your risks, what are your goals, how can we better serve you? And as part of that, we conduct a quarterly survey through an organization called Pulse. And what you're seeing on the right there is some data from a recent survey we conducted around resiliency. And it was clear that ransomware and data breaches were the top two most concerning factors that folks like yourself had when considering what they're trying to protect for as part of their resiliency strategy. And that's really what brings us to this conversation today is we've heard from you and we've tried to put together the right content for you to really drive a good conversation around what can be done and give you some insights and some actionable advice on how to really set yourself up to be able to recover from a ransomware scenario without having to pay criminals. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the threat landscape. We're going to talk a little bit about the distinctions between ransomware recovery and other traditional disaster recovery scenarios, like, for example, environmental hazards or user error. We're going to tease out some differences there that I think are really important. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about what the requirements are to build a effective ransomware recovery solution and how you can take action today. And I've got to tell you, I hope Mohammed can join from AWS because he is extremely passionate about this stuff. But I've got to tell you that Ben Miller here at Intervision is more appropriate for this conversation than just about anybody in the industry. I've had the pleasure of working with Ben for about a decade now, a better part of a decade. And he leads the resiliency practice as our senior cloud solution engineer. And he's really responsible for the design and the implementation of what we do to help organizations recover from ransomware. You can see on our website some example case studies of the work that Ben's done. And I'm just really proud to work with the guy, and he's a really sharp dude. So I'm going to turn things over to him. Hopefully, again, Mohammed can join in the conversation. We're going to switch things around because we're planning on having him starting, but hopefully he can still get into the webinar and fill us in on his perspective. But Ben, if you don't mind, I'm going to stop sharing here and turn things over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate the setup. I cannot have been working with you for that long. I am not that old.
Right. That's what I tell myself too.
Exactly. All right, let me share out my screen here, and you can see the presentation about our restorative strategy, which is what we're going to start talking about here. All right, Chris, just want to confirm that you can see the share. Okay, great.
Yep.
So, as Chris set this up, obviously the demand, the attention to steal what little energy and focus we have away from our core business has been driven or been in the ransomware space. The news has been talking about ransomware. It has been driving headlines, and rightly so. This is a threat that we've not, of a nature that traditional IT has not had to address previously. It affects our data and our infrastructure in ways that are, unable to ignore. It puts not only our operations at risk, but it also puts our data at risk as new strategies arise to not only invade and impact operations, but also to hold the data ransom. And then on the other side, when the data is leaked, holding that data as a, if you will, extortion to not release the data. There are more and more ways that the criminals who are, as they become successful, more well-funded, have written their software and approaches for these cyber attacks in fashions that essentially keep us up at night, imagining what if that happens to me. And that's a scary thought. And frankly, also hearing the concept of it's not if, it's when is also a scary thought. That will change the perspective of a lot of people in IT. We are very used to, from business standpoints, writing checks where there are clear return on investments. It's a little more difficult for IT organizations to understand spending money to avoid loss. And so this type of security and protection is, I don't want to say new, but it's a little more difficult of a conversation to have. And with that lead in, that's where I'm going to talk about this, how to begin your strategy about that recovery aspect of the of recovering from ransomware. Now, first of all, categorizing it, ransomware is a disaster. There's no other way to put it. Intervision has had a long-standing solution for recovering from disaster recovery as a service. Where we address more of those traditional approaches of an infrastructure failure of some kind, whether that's human error, power, environmental, whatever that is. If my environment of operations, my production environment ceases to operate properly, how can I fail over? How can I run somewhere else? That's the traditional approach. Now, when we're dealing with ransomware as a disaster, we have to understand that this is a disaster, but it's of a different nature. My data is corrupt. There may be impact from that data, corruption throughout all of my data that I was replicating. So what do we need to do to address that? Well, The strategy to approach this starts at the top of the business. Disaster recovery, ransomware recovery are business problems, not just IT problems. Yes, the business delegates the execution of that to IT in most places, but the guidance around what is a disaster, or I'm sorry, what is an acceptable response to a disaster comes from the top. That's one of my biggest messages here. IT services and their uptime come from business decisions. How long is it okay to not have application X available to our clients? It's different if that's a monthly report than it is a online e-commerce transaction site. Everybody wants 100% uptime. Right. But as as uptime approaches 100% perfect, that dollar sign approaches infinity. And somewhere along that curve is the right balance of uptime and availability. And this guidance from the business is providing your recovery point objective, how much data you can lose, and your recovery time objective, which is how fast a service needs to be recovered. The questions then to put out when talking about disaster recovery and ransomware recovery strategies are the similar 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. Because we have to cover all our bases, especially now with ransomware in there. We have to consider that scenario as one of the types of disasters we're recovering from. So the who is going to do the recovery? If you're dealing with a production outage environment, you got your IT staff working on restoring that environment. If you're in a ransomware situation, you have your IT staff and your security staff and everybody else involved trying to put out the fire and deal with that situation. So who is going to execute that recovery plan? And that's where we talk about leveraging a partner. And that's what Intervision has done for years, to be able to do recovery while you worry about the putting out the fire and taking care of that side of the business. What is being recovered? I'll talk about this more in depth. Not everything is as urgent to be recovered. A lot of things are important, so understanding what is being recovered and the speed and scenarios on how they're being recovered is important. When is it being recovered? As soon as possible, but when, the point in time is the point of this question. Building a solution that allows you to pick the appropriate point in time. A lot of solutions are designed around recovering to the latest replica or the latest copy or the last version of the stream. When in fact we're dealing with ransomware, a lot of times you want to roll back the clock and say that happened at 2 o'clock, I need to restore at 1:58. Sometimes even further back in time, depending on the situation. So making sure to take that into consideration. And where you're recovering. A lot of times for a ransomware situation, it's not a matter of just getting rid of the ransomware. It's the fact that in some cases you need to provide evidence, forensics, security evaluation, etc., around the situation for cybersecurity or the security team around this. So even if you've gotten things under control, that production environment may not be available for you to do a full production restore to. So where? And obviously we're partnered with AWS, so we've got some great ideas about how to leverage cloud in that to answer that question. And then why are you recovering? This goes back to that point that Chris brought up, and I've been talking about here as well. Ransomware is one of the disaster types of scenarios. You may have infrastructure failure, communication failures, but ransomware failure is a unique type of failure. So why are you recovering is important to ask and discuss as part of your plan for recovery. That being said,
I noticed that, I'm sorry, I noticed that Mohammed's here. Mohammed, are you in formally? If you want to unmute. I was going to say this might be a good time to have the AWS perspective, and I can.
I was going to say that's of all places, this is a fantastic place to have Mohammed step in here and talk a little bit about that. He can deliver this message a lot more in depth, which is great.
Yeah, I'm going to pass things over, Mohammed, if that's okay for you. Are you in now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Yep, I can hear you loud and clear. I'm going to switch the presenter role over to you. And then, Ben, we'll turn things back over to you to talk about recovery assurance, talk about Intervision's approach to disaster or ransomware recovery. And I'd like Mohammed to step in and talk a little bit about some AWS insights.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
All right. Can you see my deck?
Looks like it's popping up. Yep, we're in. Thanks, Mohammed.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohammed Sabunchi. I'm the principal storage based in Toronto, Canada. I apologize for the little delay, just some technical glitches. So we have a very interesting topic here, ransomware recovery, just to really discuss with you about your future plans with regard to having the right solutions in place to protect your most valuable assets, which is your data, systems, and applications, of course. So what we have today is about 10, 12 slides at the most. The agenda is to talk about the ransomware threats, what's going on in the industry, the actual view of the industry and how they view it, and then we're going to dive a little bit deep on the comparison between some of the best practices and the maturity level on how to execute it and have the right plan in place. So first and foremost, ransomware. And it's almost safe to say that ransomware is becoming the norm. Unfortunately, everywhere we look, on a weekly, daily, and even on hourly basis, we keep hearing about the new events or attacks that are taking place across the globe. No one really immune from those, continuously growing threats. According to Gartner, there's about 75% of organizations expected to face one or more ransomware threats between now and 2025. And this is quite huge number when you think about it. Another interesting fact is that those attacks are occurring in 2021 alone every 11 seconds. So if I can just take a moment to think about it, ever since I start talking, at least a whole bunch of attacks that just took place in the past 3 minutes alone. So it is reality and is something that is happening, affecting all of us, all our IT and digital space, and we have to really do something about it. So a very quick reminder, refreshment on what is ransomware. Ransomware is a malicious attack, usually is generated by hackers where they inject some sort of a malware to really block access to mission critical system and data from users. And typically there are two types of ransomware attacks or techniques. The first one is locker ransomware. And just by definition, when you look at it, it's isolating the end users from accessing data or accessing their data or their systems. Simple way to think about it, if someone were to tamper your personal device, mobile, and change the password, you would be locked out. The other one, which is probably even more effective, is the crypto ransomware. This is when malwares or hackers, they manage to encrypt the data and applications, and then the end users require to have a decrypt keys in order to gain those access back. Both of them, they have the same effect, and both of them, they have the same challenges, and in exchange for end users to gain those access, you have to pay sort of a ransom in a form of cryptocurrencies, and that's basically what's been going on in the industry. So what makes organization more vulnerable than others or more susceptible to ransomware attacks? And there are three main categories. The first one, it's all about the technical aspects. So customers usually, when they depend so much on legacy systems, or they are not really updating with their updates and patches, or as well as depending on a lot of manual processes. Of course, and to a certain extent, if they were lacking the right skill sets or the right personnel in their organizations, of course, this is going to be a major factor for stopping those attacks. The second category is all about having the awareness across the board within a company or an organization. So, employees typically they could be the first line of defense if they're well trained and well equipped. They can be alerting against any phishing techniques, or otherwise could be the weaker link for accepting and getting some of the malwares into the organizations. The last category, and it's probably the most important one in my opinion, is the governance body, or having a unified security strategy in place. And typically in a larger enterprise organizations where they have multiple regions, multiple departments, in the past, probably they would be a separate or a different type of approaches, depending, the software department, they have their own goals and they have their own techniques, the network people, the infrastructure. Of course, the best way to do that is to really have a uniform, strategy, goal, plans, and, execution in case of, attacks occur, and how to stop it as well as how to recover from it. So how is the industry looking at it, and what is actually happening from a holistic view? So in 2014, NIST framework, which is also known the National Institute Standard of Technology's framework, which has became widely adopted across, almost all sectors, all segments, all type of, organizations. It really consists of 5 main different pillars, which basically provide guidance, controls, and best practices on how to go about identifying risks, protection, detection, responding, and recovery. But almost it's safe to say that up until 2018, 2019, majority of the emphasis, majority of the focus were on the first 4 pillars. And this is part of basically a cybersecurity conversation, when, how can we be more of proactive in, stopping the threats, and how to really, prevent anything from happening to our organizations. But the hackers are getting more and more sophisticated by the day, by the hour. And unfortunately, those systems and best practices are great and they're good, but always need. It is almost the industry shifting towards having what is called the recovery goals, or the recovery plans in place, in case those 4 pillars or 4 areas didn't really stop it. This has actually took place, or really started to happen, after the Sony film production attack by the North Korean, where the US government really made a call out to the need of having a recovery plans in place. So the whole conversation today, or the whole seminar, is really to really understand and to highlight and emphasize on the importance of having the recovery plans in place. And this is basically, it's all about creating the strategy formation, understanding the cost model of, what would it cost me to take those back up and then to implement those, techniques and solutions in place, versus if I don't have anything in place. Also, it helps us in really defining the most important, applications that we want to protect. And there's really no rule of thumb. If an organization have, I don't know, 1 petabyte of data, or 10 or 100, does that mean they have to protect everything? Do they need to protect 50% of that, 30% of that? It really is subjective from one case to another. It all depends on, running those exercises, understanding each and every component within the IT domain, within the organization, to understand what does it mean if I were to lose my mail server, for instance, and how can I actually cope and operate if I were to have it, and how much time I need to actually have to recover for that. And this is exactly to take us to the what it's called the trade-off model, really understanding, as mentioned, what does it really mean for me to lose this system versus that? Is this considered a nice to have, a must to have, or it's really not a big deal if we were to really have some sort of a downtime on that. Very important. I always really, I think this is the money slide, honestly. This is where, really need organizations or teams or, they need to really spend the right time preparing for those things and having a real serious discussion across the board with business, IT, partners, and everybody, around to really understand, how to go about this. Another interesting topic is the ransomware recovery versus disaster recovery. Now, yes, it's safe to say that disaster recovery is the holistic sort of, framework, and it's important to actually have the right motion in place. But typically, data protection is a very complex topic. It really addresses a lot of different, techniques, recommendations, and, ways on how to really replicate and copies and, copies and replicate more important data and to really recall it when there's a need for that. But if we would just to take the disaster recovery concept as whole, as it shows on the left-hand side, there are different use cases. Customers or clients they could probably have their own on-premises setups between two or more data centers. They could really have a full adoption, cloud adoptions, or they could have a hybrid solution. All those use cases are valid, very important. But the question is, if we would to just apply the general DR policies in place, would that really stop or give us the ability to recover against ransomware attack? And before we answer that, the DR typically are great for, system failures, human, errors, flood, fire, disasters that could happen, power outages. But would it really stop having the malware to spread from point A to point B if in case, the malware find its way into the subnet or the domain or, or on premises or one of the 2 points as shows on the left side here? And the answer is no. And this is proven, case after case, because majority of the organization that have been compromised with those unfortunate, events are actually did have a DR in place, but they did not really have a specific ransomware sort of recovery plan or solution that really need to be catered for what they really need and how to create those up, protections. And on the right-hand side, it shows the ransomware recovery sort of solutions that we always, talk about and, we highly advise on, is to have 3 motions or principles in place. Number 1 is to have an independent account, preferably to be isolated or highly recommended to be isolated away from the existing subnets and, production environment, and to actually have it sit somewhere, as far as away from, from the customer's data centers. Most recently, majority of regulators in Asia and Europe and even in Australia, they are really started to really highlight the importance of having those accounts in the cloud, actually. The second principle is to have what is called the data immutability. And basically, how can I have that account to be locked with a worm, write once, read many, or have it vaulted, or, creating a real protection of those most valuable copies or snapshot copies of our backups. And this is what we call it, the golden copies that we need to refer back to if and when needed. And the third principle is to apply, if and when needed, the logical air gap techniques. And what we mean by that is to really have this account to be appear to the domain or to the subnet, take backups in a random hours. It could be 6 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday and 5 p.m. on Friday. It all depends on the customer use case requirement and the time that they need. But ideally, and the best recommendation is to actually have those accounts to be hidden, protected away from everybody else. And in many cases, cybersecurity team or infrastructure, whoever running those programs, not to even share the existing of this account with the rest of the organization, not alone, to announce it publicly. And that is actually the way we highly recommend. This is just a sort of a reminder of the value of the vault, why having the and why we having the account and having it in an immutable environment. But it also, there is a very important aspect to having it in the cloud. We already talked about having it, as far as away from the live production, but also the cloud could give the flexibility, the agility to spin up those accounts, to scale them up, to take whatever required sort of backups. And also it considered as a managed services. So customers don't need to worry about, having to, run POC or refresh hardware on those accounts, but really just thinking and really make all the emphasis and the focus on taking those copies and really run it and secure it and have it protected. So in the AWS case, in our vault, we have a number of technical capabilities, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it's important to really just highlight few key points. Number one is the data formats. And what we mean by that is that customers would really want to have, they need to think about taking copies of different type of formats of their data. We're not talking only about databases or VMs or block or object, but it's a combination of pretty much everything. Depending on what's important and what is the use case behind it and how we can really protect that. Interesting fact that a lot of our customers at the moment, they are taking a dump of their file configuration of their server farms, because the argument is that if we were to get compromised and if we have a total outage or total blackout, and could happen, and it's been happening, customers, they really need to refer back to their sort of a blueprint system configuration to rebuild and to power on everything from the ground back up. And those are really the extreme scenarios that everybody need to think about. Also, we are talking about having the data versioning capabilities. So when taking your copies for the month of April, May, June, July, customers can differentiate which are the copies, and they can really go back, run some forensic tests, validating those options. Yes, some of the backups could be while taking it from the on-premises or from the cloud can be checked and validated, which is options are now available and afforded by being offered by the large extent of more like APN network partners for AWS, the likes of Veeam, for instance. But having additional forensic validation capabilities on the cloud, on those backed up copies, is also very highly recommended on that regard. And then, of course, you need to think about the sub-millisecond latencies, because, speed matters, in time of recovery. And I will have just about almost a couple more slides. The approach that we usually talk about, and when we are dealing with our partners, the likes of Intervision, is to really highly address and recommend having the time to really do the right assessment and to have what it's called the maturity model implementation. If the system were to be more of a protected level or advanced plus. Of course, each solution comes with sets of capabilities. It all depending on the time that required to implement those solutions, the complexity, and the features. Of course, also, and in some cases, if the customer wants to go ahead and apply, the approach as it shows with the protected option, for instance, this could be could be done in a few days. As long as the customer has the right, definition of their system, they have the right tools, they really identify what need to be done, and it's just a straightforward of taking those copies, as long as it's fully compatible with our S3 object locked, capabilities and offerings. When the case to go with the advanced plus, this is probably requires some modifications, requires some coding, requires some changes, because it could be very powerful. It could be very, flexible, but it also takes some time to really get it right to fit the actual business and need and requirement. And basically, this is leading us to the next or the last slides. Basically, we always recommend having the following approach or the call to action is to really identify or to agree or just get the buy-ins from from the business that this is an important topic. It is time for us to really think about it and to really take some proactive measures rather than wait until things could go bad or could go wrong. And the way to do it is to really engaging with the right partners with the right capabilities, and to conduct or perform what it's called the assessment phase. This is not just a technical assessment. This is actually a strategy formation type of way, understanding everything needed for the business or the internal business requirement, understand the technology in place, understand if there's any gaps, and of course, very important to really identify the right partners that you want to engage with. And there are, the partners could be a consultancy partner who can really help run and drive the whole implementation, as well as, technology partners, with the right tools. Companies that they can actually take some of the, the backup, or if there's any forensic, detection tools, and so on and so forth. And finally, and last but not least, of course, is to have a goal in mind, the timeline, the budget, the expected, implementation, sort of a project plan to be put in place to really go ahead and execute that. And with that, I actually think this is the time I have for today. So I really thank you so much for listening. And once again, I do apologize for the little delay where, when I try to log in. I'll be welcoming any questions, maybe now or after the session during the Q&A. I'll leave it up to the team and Chris.
Thank you, Mohammed. And again, thank you for joining us. Technical issues, what can you do, right? There's not much we can do about it. We do appreciate you chiming in. Always appreciate our partnership with AWS, and your insights were certainly helpful in this conversation. So I'm going to turn things back over to Ben Miller. He's going to talk a little bit more about the considerations and the things you need to be thinking about as you're building out your strategy, using the model that we've been using for our recovery capabilities for the last 10 years or so, with a heavy emphasis on the capabilities for recovering for ransomware. So Ben, I'll go ahead and turn things back over to you and let you run with it. Thank you.
Great, and thanks, Mohammed. He, as I said, has a great way of expressing a number of the things that I just brushed on as we go. The critical pieces being understanding that ransomware is a unique type of disaster, requires its own thought, its own plan, and frankly, in some cases, its own RTO for recovering from that unique type of event. And as Chris said, I'm kind of going to talk a little bit about our approach. We have a strategy, we call it recovery assurance. We've applied this to disaster recovery, but the same thing works with ransomware recovery as we're talking to our customers. And it's, even if you're not working with us to go through this process, this is a process that can help you from organize your thoughts and your organization around developing and running an appropriate solution for recovery. And as I mentioned previously, it always starts at the top. So the first step here is that business requirements and goal understanding the risks that are out there, talking about those infrastructure risks, but also those ransomware risks, and what the experience in recovery needs to be. This is all about those RPOs and the RTOs and the scenarios that you're recovering from. Then moving from that process, and I say process, and these are circles for a reason, because these are cyclical. This doesn't happen in one meeting. This doesn't happen in one go. You go through the process of querying and talking about and deciding upon these requirements, business requirements, as a process. And that now moves into the design aspect of things, where you're saying, okay, in order to meet these requirements, these are what the design looks like. There's some great elements that Mohammed talked about, and I'll talk about some other tiering approaches as well that can be brought into what this design looks like to protect against ransomware and recover from it. And down at the bottom, we actually execute something we call joint engineering when we're working with our customers to bring in the stakeholders, and highly recommend doing this, even if you're doing it internally, is get the network person. Network is foundation of recovery. You got to be able to have access to the servers. Get the server team, get the infrastructure, the virtualization, get them together to talk through what these requirements and what the recovery design looks like. You will find out more about your application with a meeting like that. It never fails when we run a joint engineering team meeting. We listen a great deal during that, and customers talk about and discover things about their application and the way their users are using it. Taking that design then, that again, circle there has been designed, goes into implementing and building the solution. And the outcome of that is a playbook. And I refer to it as a playbook because, like we've mentioned several times, there are different scenarios. Just like when the sports team takes the field, they have different plays that they can run. The same thing should be with your disaster recovery playbook. There should be specific instructions about a disaster recovery approach for ransomware, as opposed to an infrastructure failure, as opposed to an environmental failure, or a partial or full data center. These things need to be documented in that playbook, not just as we boot servers in this order, but a clear scenario about how we recover this data, in what fashion, why, who's doing what topics, because these are the steps to the dance of how you're going to recover. The hand in hand with that is the testing. You've built the playbook, and our teams on the field drill these plays over and over again. I'm using a sports analogy, but it's the same thing when Intervision's providing a disaster recovery as a service, as our recovery teams exercise these plans with our customers over and over again. And the reason that is that the teams are familiar with each other. They're familiar with the process. They understand what needs to be done, because the last thing you want to do is figure out the plan during the disaster. When my kids started driving, I had each of them learn how to change the tire on their car while I watched. And the reason was they needed to be familiar with it before they had the problem. Same thing with testing. Health management and operations of that solution are the next most important things. It's not a set and forget. And the reason for that is obviously it's a living replication of your data. It's a living copy of your data to the target. And in order to do that, you need to make sure that that's still working, monitoring it, evaluating the health, and your environment is not static. Your production environment is changing. There are new servers, new solutions, updates, patches that may affect how it's being replicated. And so that health management and operations practices around both the replication and making sure that the target is receiving and everything is working are critical to this process. And that creates this circle in the middle where you test again. We encourage our customers to test twice a year, and we encourage them to pick different scenarios from the playbook so they can test differently and restore differently, and they are familiar with all the plays in the playbook. And that playbook, you'll eventually find, is different, doesn't work exactly. The playbook's not different. The environment's different. There's been some drift or shift, and that playbook needs to be updated to match the way it is currently. You can have the best change control practices in the world, but there still may be some drift. So it's critical that that playbook development cycle is part of the cycle where that's tested and reviewed over and over again. And finally, if it does unfortunately happen, remember the W's I talked about. Who is going to recover when you're in a storm? Again, that's something that we provide for our customers, is the ability to fail them over when they're in recovery. And even if you're not working with a partner, having a plan for who's going to be responsible for getting us alive and recover, or who's going to take responsibility for cleaning up the production environment and making sure that that's brought online. And finally, and often overlooked, a key part of the playbook and this process is making sure that the fail back occurs. Once you are in the target, that you can comfortably run there for as long as you need, and then you can comfortably and in control fail back to your production environment and continue this cycle over again. So this is what we call recovery assurance. It's a process that we use all the time. It does work. Our customers attest to that fact. I'm actually going to reiterate some of the things that Mohammed said here. I'm going to mention the trifecta that we use when we're talking about helping to design the ransomware recovery piece of the disaster recovery scenario. It's that multi-factor authentication that ensures that the control plane and systems cannot be accessed without a second factor, like your cell phone or a key fob or whatever that is, so that scripts and compromised credentials can't be used to infect additional data. The air gap, and Mohammed talked about this, an air gap not only in terms of your data being inaccessible from your production plane, but the accounts even being air gapped so that they are not, those credentials cannot be compromised and that data cannot be compromised. And finally, immutability. Once upon a time, IT used to call it worm, write once, read many. Immutability sounds far more intellectual. So we'll stick with immutability. These three factors need to be built into every disaster recovery for ransomware design that's put out there. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit as I talk about some of these ransomware tools. Mohammed talked about tiering, the trade-offs, about the ability to recover, the speed of recovery, et cetera. I talked about earlier working with the business to set up those RTOs and RPOs. And we talk in terms, there are a lot of terminology out there here at Innovision. We talk in terms of our product offerings to help customers tier out how they build and design the tiers of their recovery, because some things are far more urgent to have online than other things. And especially, I'm going to talk briefly about a traditional approach when you have core foundational services, perhaps like Active Directory or security, et cetera, components that need to be online and running for you to be able to recover quickly. You see there are DRAS run, ready, and restore, and BAS laid out there across the top, and those are laid out across AWS's terminology for similar types of things. These match up pretty well. But the reason we have BAS and what we call our DRAS restore separate is because just backing your data up off-site doesn't give you a recovery plan. And that whether it's backup as a service or you're just leveraging S3 immutable repository to store your data offsite, that's great. That gets you immutable data, but it doesn't give you a recovery plan. And so what DRAS restore is about is it's about looping in your backups into that cycle that I talked about on the last slide for having a process and having a plan for how you're going to recover it, and it's tested. So these tiers of the run needs to be online immediately, the ready, minutes to hours, the restore, that's restoring out of backups, are good ways to talk about internally and externally about how you've tiered your applications. Because as you can imagine, the further left you go, the more dollar signs. As the further right you go, the fewer. And you finding the right balance between urgency and risk and cost is what this allows you to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples and strategy of leveraging our disaster recovery with with AWS, specifically about ransomware. You don't need to, zoom in on this necessarily. I'm going to talk at a fairly high level, but on the left, we have our production data center and we're replicating data over to the cloud. Now, previously or without ransomware, you'll see that in the bottom middle here is a production subnet where I've put some Active Directory controllers, maybe an always on availability group that's a SQL server. And I've put those out there because I want to be able to fail over from an infrastructure standpoint pretty quickly. Well, ransomware comes into the picture and it changes things a bit. So let's recast this from a perspective of, okay, how does this help me when ransomware is here? Well, first of all, one of our approaches is exactly what Mohammed said, is when we're working with our customers, we actually own the account, the AWS account and the credentials, and it requires multi-factor authentication. We have an air-gapped account that requires MFA. There is, your production environment is not going to compromise the control plane of that account. Secondly, if we look at things in what we call our run tier or this always on tier with the eye to ransomware, like that Active Directory and SQL, those are directly in the blast radius of a ransomware attack, right? You're sending data over there, they're replicating internally. They probably share the same credential plane as your production workloads out of necessity. However, what we can do is leverage the AWS services that are built in that allow it to be a simple matter of taking an hourly snapshot of those and storing those for as many restore points as you need. Allows you to pick a point in time in the past and say, okay, we were compromised at 2 p.m. We're going to recover at 1:55 p.m. Or okay, 1:50 because the snapshot hit at that point in time. And those snapshots are not addressable without access to the control plane, and we already talked about how that control plane is air-gapped. The other tier that I'm going to talk about here is the recovery subnet. These are grayed out because we typically replicate with a hypervisor or other type of replication technology that stores those VMs as recoverable, as bootable. That was that DRes ready tier I talked about. And the value here is that using the right solution, we leverage Zerto and Cloud Endure to do these. These allow replication and point-in-time recovery, again, so that that older data can't be changed. Even if the production is compromised and replicated, that compromise has been replicated, there is a journal and point-in-time snapshots that can be restored. In addition, some of these technologies allow you to replicate or back up to S3 with the immutable bit, so it's vaulted, and all of the workloads need to be that need to be recovered in this environment need to be protected, no matter what tier they're in, with an immutable backup. That means that if all else fails, we can restore from backup. And Mohammed was talking about that. Replication to S3 and being able to fast recover those VMs, like in this DRes ready tier, again, allowing for a great balance between cost and risk. Some of the other additional value is once you are leveraging AWS to do disaster recovery, some additional services that come on is, for example, AppStream or workspaces to provide desktops. If the production environment has been compromised, it could be because, and the endpoints have been compromised as well. So if you need to replace endpoints, leveraging services like this, leveraging AWS backup to be able to now start, you've got a clean environment booted and recovered in AWS to be able to start taking your backup instances of that as well. The other tools that can come into play are these services, database services, file system services, and I even put machine learning on there. Think about it. If your data is being replicated to the cloud, what can you do with it that will allow you to transform, going back to Chris's run, grow, and transform conversation, your business using machine learning against your data that you have a copy of elsewhere? It begins to expand what you can use your disaster recovery environment for. And finally, there is the entire family of AWS services that can be wrapped around recovery. Once you're in recover into AWS, you need something, it's there. There are literally thousands of choices. So AWS provides a fantastic cost-effective model, very elastic to be able to only use the resources you need at time of recovery. The ability to leverage built-in services like the backup and the vaulting and the storage tiers that allow for that design. I'm gonna actually pick a question here real quick. It was asked about because I think it's pertinent at this point about what about dormant ransomware that sits that infects and is dormant for a long period of time. We actually have customers that have been faced with this, and it is a difficult situation, no doubt, because you know, even if you are retaining point in time recover points back in time prior to the bloom, they could be infected. We've heard stories of, you know, 6 months or even longer. Yes, we all keep backups at least a year, but again, your environment has changed. You have 6 months worth of data that has changed that you can't afford to lose. So one of the ways we help customers from a ransomware perspective is the first half of the conversation has to be about protect, detect, and respond to that. And so first of all, you're hoping that you don't ever need to come to this point. You're putting an investment in place from a security standpoint to make sure that you're able to detect it when it comes into your environment, that you have scanning capability both on your network and against your data that will reveal if something has been come into your network. Your hope is that you never have to use this piece of the technology. This technology is when you break glass in case of emergency. That being said, if you are in that situation, we are able to leverage the technology that we use for disaster recovery to restore into an isolated sandbox and purge data. Typically, by this time, we know what the ransomware is, we know how to remove it, and we're able to restore environments into clean networks that are isolated from the internet so they can't reach out and hit a trigger to do a bloom. They're available, they're online, they can be scanned and purged. And in the worst case scenarios, we can actually bring up disks, attach them to other servers that are clean and purge them from that standpoint. So there is recovery efforts that can be taken. Clearly, you're not talking about an RTO of minutes here, but what we're talking about is being able to purge the ransomware from the environment before bringing it live in that recovery scenario. So hopefully that covers that question. All right, so I'm going to tell a story. We're looking at time here, so I'm going to pause. Chris, I don't know if we have time to go through this or if I should pass it over.
Absolutely hit this story. I'm going to make my segment extremely brief, but I think this story is extremely important. So go ahead and touch on that.
All right, so I'm going to tell a story about one of our customers from their perspective. And one Saturday night, Janet, who is the IT director, got a call from her team. It's the last call anybody wants. 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, alerts are going off, servers are down, ransomware is rampant in the environment. That's one of those gulp moments. Things looked bleak. It was rampant in their environment. So they said, please, hop on the incident line. They had a practice in place. Everybody was on deck. They were all on the incident line. Before she could hang up the phone and call into the incident line, she got a call from Intervision. The recovery team had noticed that there were errors coming from their environment, called them up to see if they needed help. She said, give me a minute. I got to figure out what's going on, but stand by. Got on that incident bridge, talked to her team. It was bleak. 40 terabytes of production data encrypted, all of their application servers down, email was down, calls were starting to come in. She knew that they had people who worked 24/7 at this company, and there were just going to be more and more calls that were going to come in. Good news was that they had been able to isolate and stop the ransomware from spreading further, but there was still a mess in their environment. So she said, start cleaning it up. She called back to Intervision and said, let's do it. Let's bring it up before this point in time. Intervision's team, within 10 minutes of that, had the environment in a sandbox online, ready for her and one of her team members to pop in, validate, run the ransomware validation tool against, ensure that the environment was clean. They validated it, and said go, and we're able to commit that sandbox environment to a new disaster recovery production environment, clean and ready to go. And in 1 hour, they were able to have 40 terabytes of data and all of their servers and critical applications, email, everything back online and working. Their VPN users failed over to the DR VPN and connected into the new environment. They were able to continue working. They actually ran in a hybrid state as they brought some pieces back to production. They got their forensic data, they cleaned it up, and they were able to bring some things back. And so they bridged cloud and their infrastructure. They ran that way. And then 2 weeks after the event had happened, during a scheduled and smooth process, we worked and we failed back the environment to their production environment. And with a smooth, less than an hour maintenance window, they were back in their environment and running in production after what started off as a horrific phone call. Her business owners told Janet that service was worth every penny that they had ever paid for it. This is a customer that had been paying into a service that they hoped never to use for years. And like I said at the beginning, that's a hard sell to an to a business to spend money to prevent loss. It's a hard sell until they experience it and they see the value in how they've been able to prevent loss. And that's the kind of confidence that is important in designing a recovery solution. Why did this work? This worked because they had a plan, they had their data protected off-site, there was proactive monitoring and detection, they had a familiar recovery team, an up-to-date playbook. I'm going back to that process that we talked about. They had practiced the recovery. They had a team to run recovery while another team took care of cleaning up. They had a production quality DR target that they could fail over to, and they weren't worried about trying to get back out of there in a hurry. And they had a fail back plan. So it's important that these bullets, these concepts are what gave them the confidence to be able to fail over within an hour, run while they cleaned up their environment, and fail back, and only impact their users less than 2 hours, totaling over the entire event. With that, I'll pass it back over to Chris to talk about a little bit more about our partnership and the synergy that I've been talking about, that Mohammed's been talking about leveraging AWS and Intervision as a partnership.
Ben, that couldn't be much more difficult to follow, but I'm going to keep this extremely brief. So the next slide here, we talked a little bit about a partnership with AWS, and really what that's about, Ben, if you want to hit that slide, is we just couple our deep experience in disaster recovery, in resiliency, in ransomware recovery with the leading cloud technology platform, AWS. And you see, the benefits of the two together are really what allow us to deliver more, deliver that confidence. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why do our organizations choose to work with us? We have a proven and guaranteed recovery strategy. Okay, you can do your due diligence, look at our case studies, look at our client satisfaction scores. Our SLAs are the strongest in the industry, and they are absolutely ironclad guaranteed that you will be able to recover at an agreed upon state, which means your folks will actually be able to access their applications and data with a guarantee backed by our SLAs. Our approach has been recognized by Gartner and Forrester since the inception of the Magic Quadrant for disaster recovery. We were featured as a leader or a visionary throughout the course of that. They've since retired that report, but we were recognized throughout its existence. Our process is deeply tested, and it's also thoroughly documented. So you know what the recovery playbook is going to look like because you're part of the process of developing it. So finally here, not everyone's ready to commit to a fully managed approach, right? We understand that. And one of the most important critical steps is really elevating this conversation to the business level. As Ben talked about, this is not the easiest sell in the world, right? You need to have a solution for this, and it's not often easy to prove out why the investment should be made or how. And really what we have here is a workshop specifically designed to do that. This is not just a technology conversation. This is a business conversation. And on the next slide, we talk a little bit about what the outcomes of this workshop are and what it's designed to do. It's designed through a deliverable to engage stakeholders, to focus on the key initiatives and get their agreement on what resiliency needs to look like. Set the define and set the metrics for measuring what the recovery objectives need to look like. So there is that agreed state across your stakeholders and your team to really understand what does this need to look like, and then provide that plan. You know, whether or not you choose to work with Intervision, you're going to get a plan for how to shore up the gaps that we find through this process. So for those of you who want to talk more about our managed approach and our platform for recovery, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can contact us on intervision.com. The contact button's big, bright, and orange. Just click that and we can start the conversation. But one of the ways we can get this going is through this maturity workshop. So you're not making a massive investment, to shore this up. You can start the conversation there. So I'll just close out with one slide here that just talks about our partnership with the AWS. We have all the credentials and accreditations that you would expect from a company that's been working with AWS for years now and has hundreds of thousands of billable hours in AWS cloud. But we really have, this comprehensive approach, not only for disaster recovery, but for migrations, for really all your operations in AWS. A deep, deep legacy in the data center with over 25 years of experience there. So we can help you bridge that gap. We know you probably have an on-premise data center and a cloud-first initiative. We're really designed to help you to bridge that gap and realize your cloud-first strategy. So with all that said, I wanted to open it up for some questions. I know we're over time. I really apologize and sorry for some of the technical difficulties. There was one question that came in about how would you detect a possible exposure that has not been triggered? Ben, I don't know if you had any thoughts about that. I know you talked a little bit about the detection piece, but there was another question that came in about that. That was a follow-on for the corrupted backups question.
Right. So there are a couple things there. Is detection is its own science. We're stepping a little bit out of my comfort zone, and I actually have people I really respect and work with here at Intervision in our security group that have products and services that will help to detect that malware. And what I'm talking about are the intrusion detection, more than that, the network scanning and monitoring for malware, and then the not only endpoint protection and scanning for malware and viruses, but also the data content scanning for fingerprints of encryption and the malware fingerprints, similar to like a virus where it comes into your environment. Plus all of the traditional approaches that you would look for incursion on your network or scan for incursion on your network. Those are the types of investments and things that need to be upfront. If you're talking about how would you go and see if you have been impacted today, there are specific malware scanning tools, and that's where again I would reference my my co-workers here at Intervision in our security division to help talk about the best ways to scan those and analyze your data and environment for that.
Thanks for that, Ben. And then finally here, I know we're over time, but a quick question on how can an organization start to test against this, right? If they've built something internally on their own, what are some ways they can, any insights on how, they might go about testing?
Yeah, testing is difficult, and it goes to how the solution is designed. The key thing about being able to test and keep the weight low is to design for that in your DR. For example, we leverage technologies that allow us to perform tests for our customers, typically in the span of a standard working day. It doesn't interrupt their production because it's been designed for isolation. And it allows for those sandbox tests. Now, there are those that say, look, sandbox tests aren't good enough. They need to be able to do an actual failover. We do those as well, and those do take more time to sit down, build a testing plan, build the success factors plan, and then execute that during the appropriate maintenance windows. That's something that we actually work with our DRAS service as part of that testing, is sitting down with that pre-test planning, execute the test, post-test cleanup and validation. And honestly, for those people out there who have a very lean IT team, and I think that's everybody, engaging with a partner that can help you do it is critical. I mean, I know that sounds a little self-serving coming from, hey, we have a product that does that, but there's a reason that we do. We've talked to our customers. We've heard the demand for, we don't test because we don't have the resources. Great. Then work with somebody who can bring those resources to bear.
Thanks for that, Ben. And again, apologies for going a little long here and apologies for the technical difficulties, but Ben, you really knocked it out of the park. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation today. We will be following up with a recording and an opportunity to connect with one of our experts here at Intervision. But in the meantime, please visit intervision.com and click that contact button if you'd like to talk a little bit more with our team here. Thanks again for your time, and we appreciate you joining this conversation. Take care.